Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the program this evening, Through My Eyes with Professor Bolaji Akinyemi. Prof, you are welcome to the program this evening.
Thank you very much. Once again, I've been looking forward to our weekly interaction with, well, they've now become part of us on this program. So thank you so much for having me here again.
Thank you, sir, for being here. Prof, there is so much going on across the different nations of the world that, as usual, would like to hear your views on. But I want to start today from Tunisia, where some have even gone as far as accusing the president of a coup after he dismissed the prime minister. And even further down today, we've heard that there has been a lot more movement from the president to other senior officials. What is your take on what's going on right now in Tunisia?
Well, thank you for that question. You will recall on this very program, we discussed, it might have been our town hall format. I don't remember too well now, where we discussed the conundrum between development and democracy. Yes, it is true that Tunisia was the crucible of the Arab Spring, and from Tunisia it spread to other places. It is true that the agitation in Tunisia bred parliament, freedom, the expulsion of the dictator who was there, and freedom of speech, freedom for trade unions, etc., etc. But what it didn't bring was development. It didn't bring economic palliatives, because, as usual for developments in low income or middle income countries, it sought approval by Western countries, by the developed countries, for what was happening in Tunisia. And the developed countries gave that approval on condition that Tunisia paid the debt that it owed to high-income countries. But what the high-income countries didn't do was to return all the money stolen by the previous dictator, which were held in high income in banks in income countries. So you expected Tunisia to pay the debt, but you didn't empower Tunisia with wherewithal which it will be prepared, it will be able to pay the debt. And that was where things started going astray in Tunisia. Yes, they got democracy, but as one correspondent I was listening to said about 3 days ago, they got democracy, they didn't get bread. They got democracy, they didn't get sugar. They didn't get milk. They couldn't feed their children. They couldn't pay school fees for the children. Even the country itself, like what you are starting to see in Lebanon, the country could not sustain the infrastructural development that were needed. Yes, there was a parliament. Parties were having endless debates. But what parliament did not produce was economic development program. And that is what finally broke the proverbial camel's back, where the president then took the position. And I quote, I'm not quoting him, I'm quoting actually an English philosopher. For forms of government, let fools argue. What is best administered is best. So he decided to dissolve the parliament, dissolve government, and simply said, I'm going to ensure that the people get bread, they get sugar, they get milk, children are fed. The country is not going to be starved into chaos. He had his eye on what happened in Egypt, where finally you had the military step in with a military coup in order to stop the chaos that was going on in Egypt. And he also had his eye on Lebanon, which is gradually falling off the cliff. He wasn't just going to allow that in the name of having democracy. And that's why you had lots of people on the streets supporting him, and you also have the military supporting him. So this always is going to be the problem in middle and low income countries, where they are faced with democracy that is not producing palliatives for the people.
But Prof, a question some of the laymen may be saying, I know you talk about the fact that he's got support, but going as far as sacking a lot of senior government officials at the same time, isn't that going to throw more risk into stability anyway, which means that the people may not necessarily get what they're looking for as quickly as they want?
There is always that possibility. There is always competition. I mean, you take a risk when you decide to put policies in place as an alternative to already existing. You'll recall that also part of what is going on now is, I think there's a judicial panel that is investigating a lot of people. Now, I understand that that judicial panel actually was a program put in place before he decided to dissolve government. But the people the public officials that is removing from office, I'm sure there are things, allegations against them. Again, I know you are going to say, well, those are allegations, not proved. They have not been adjudged by the judiciary to be guilty. I know of a country in Africa where there are cases that have been going on for 10 years, corruption cases going on for 10 years. Lebanon is a case in point where, was it a year ago, you had that ship that exploded in Beirut's harbor. Nobody has been charged to court. No minister, no high public official had been held responsible for that. In fact, from my point of view, one of the unfortunate idiosyncrasy, should we say that, of democratic judiciary is that it is in competition, or it is racing against time for delivery of even justice that it is supposed to deliver. When a case takes 10 years, and in the case of my own country, 30 years, it will take you from filing a case in the High Court to getting a judgment at the Supreme Court, unless it is a political case, dealing with elections and what have you. But dealing with corruption, dealing with criminal matters, 30 years it may take you before you get justice, or before you get a judgment. That judgment is just or not. So, it's somehow you've got to get a democracy that is in sync with justice, in sync with the judicial system, and in sync with governance. If any of this is out of step, then it's going to derail the whole process.
Prof, you mentioned something there about how long a case may take in your country, and I want to bring something to your attention to get your view on this, because I know you must have seen this piece of news, and this is the one where U.S. lawmakers have agreed to stop $875 million worth of defense equipment sale to Nigeria, and the chairman of that Foreign Relations Committee even went as far as saying there needs to be a fundamental rethink of the rules of engagement with Nigeria. How do you respond to that, being a Nigerian, Prof?
Well, I am not surprised. Actually, we are back to the Obama days, because under Obama, there were things, military equipment, on which he placed an embargo. Nigeria could not import equipment, some of which had been paid for when Bush was president. Not only did they do that, they also ensured that other countries did not sell military equipment to Nigeria. They blocked all the avenues that the Jonathan administration was pursuing to get military equipment to fight the Boko Haram. So it's almost as if we've gone back to that period. And it creates, frankly, a foreign policy dilemma for countries that are the targets of American human rights issues like this, in the sense that you run the danger of pushing a country then into going to buy arms from the Chinese or buy arms from the Russians. And there are a lot of arms in the market. And yet, I'm not really sure, to tell the truth, that this is the best way for the United States to go about things. If the issues are human rights issues, the behavior of the government, well, I will hope that such an embargo will get the attention of government, and that the government itself will now put in place measures that the security forces would, should we say, moderate their own treatment of their citizens. But at the same time, the citizens suffer from the actions of the terrorists. Surely it's also part of the United States foreign policy to counter terrorism or to help countries sustain their ability to respond to terrorist actions in their country. So you are not going to have what? Conflict, even between what American objectives are and what the objectives, the policies objectives are leading to. To me, it's not an easy issue to deal with. As I said, there are some people who say, good, the security forces have been against the people, they need to be caught, fine. But then when the terrorists, the Boko Haram, the Islamic State for West Africa, the what do you call them, the herdsmen, the kidnappers, the bandits, when they start their activities, it is against the people who suffer, not even the government.
But Prof, like you've pointed out, I think some people would argue that they haven't really seen the best use of the existing equipment in combating some of these security challenges that you've rightfully highlighted, and that there is no assurance that this is again not another way of people perpetrating corruption. What would you say to that, sir?
This is not an easy issue to address. Frankly, I would rather live under a civilian regime with all its imperfections than live under an Islamic jihadist regime. I will still continue to push back at a civilian government with its imperfections than run the risk of living. Well, ask the people in Afghanistan now. The areas that have been covered, that have been conquered by the Taliban, they are starting to execute what do you call people who make jokes on programs?
Comedians?
Comedians, thank you. They are starting to execute comedians on the grounds that comedy is against the Quran. They are starting to go from house to house, arresting young girls, single girls, and in some places married women, and distributing them amongst their fighters. So, I mean, whatever may be the weaknesses of the government in Kabul, I will, if I were an Afghan, either I will leave the country or I will prefer to live under the civilian government in Kabul than to live under the Taliban government. So whatever it is that will help sustain civilian governance, I think it's not something we should take positions that can weaken civilian governance. I believe that even though human rights issues, corruption issues will come up, and should you let the government, the civil government, know that they will run the risk of losing access to these weapons unless the security forces ship up. They will simply you just have to continue to push and not to cut off the sources of supply of weapons that may weaken the ability of the civil government to cope with the terrorists.
Thank you for that, sir. Let's move on to another issue in Africa, and this time with regards to the African Union. And this is where they have granted Israel observer status at the African bloc. Now, some nations have kicked against this, including South Africa, who said it was a unilateral decision by the leaders of the AU without consultation with the members. Sir, could you help us unravel the implications of this situation that is evolving here?
There have been two categories of membership of the Pan-African organization since 1963. And at that time, it was called the Organization of African Unity. You had the members, ordinary members, and then you had observers, non-African countries that were observers, granted observer status. Now, this is something that is routine for international organizations. And at that time, Israel, the Palestinian organization, were observers, were granted observer status. I think it was a mistake or a misleading judgment that when countries in America countries of African origin in America, like Haiti, like Cuba, applied also to be observers. They were rejected. They were rejected under at that time, the misleading assessment that this will simply introduce American influence into the Organization of African Unity. I don't know how that could have been, because observers, they can speak, but they have no vote. When the Organization of African Unity transmuted into African Union, Gaddafi was sufficiently influential enough within the decision-making process of the African Union to block Israeli new application to continue its membership as an observer member or now of the African Union. And as long as Gaddafi was alive and influential, Israel's application continued to be rejected. What has now happened is that last year, Israel again reapplied, and this time it was not put to a vote of the members of the African Union. It was the Commission, which was kind of the ruling body. Things were patterned on the European Union, so you'll understand that the Commission has been empowered to take decisions on certain issues on behalf of its members. And obviously, the African Union took the position that this is one of the issues on which it could take decisions on behalf of the member countries. South Africa is now challenging that. It caught me by surprise, I must admit. Number one, I was not even aware that there was a toss up and down going on over Israeli observer membership. I wasn't aware. Should the African Union have taken the decisions taken? Well, they started up an honest nest, and with South Africa challenging their decision, obviously, the first of all, Council of Foreign Ministers, and then the heads of states annual summit will have to take a position on the issue. But you will recall that Israeli diplomatic offensive in Africa, especially in the past, especially under Trump. I mean, Trump was not Prime Minister of Israel, but Trump was, a good ally of Israel with considerable influence on a lot of African countries. The diplomatic blitzkrieg of Israel under Netanyahu. He visited the Ivory Coast, he visited Liberia, he visited several African countries. And then you will recall towards the tail end of Trump's presidency, you had that Abrahamic treaties with Sudan and several Arab countries. So, getting back its observer status in the African Union must have been regarded as an icing on the cake for Israel. And but it's going to lead to a contentious issue, I must say, all hanging around the treatment of the Palestinians by the Israelis. Whether the Arab countries should be members of the AU was something that came up for debate right from the beginning, when the Organization of African Unity was established. At that time, such was the commitment to the colonial struggle by the Arab countries, their support for decolonization in Zimbabwe, Mozambique, South Africa, Angola, and what have you, that, people like NASA, Bourguiba were in power, and such was their commitment to being regarded, well, not to being regarded as Africans, really, but such was their commitment to the anti-colonial struggle that people like Nkrumah, Sekou Touré, Modibo Keita, even the Emperor of Ethiopia carried the day that Arab countries must be regarded as members of the Organization of African Unity, that it will be playing into the hands of imperialists to exclude them from membership of this nascent African organization. Now, times have changed. Times have changed. There was a time when Sese Seko Mobutu, president of Zaire at that time, again raised this issue of membership of Arab countries. So if you are now having this challenge that's going to come up in the debate, I just hope it's not going to open the Pandora's box as to who is an African.
Yes. So there's a question here.
Entitled to be here.
There's a question here on, this one is from YouTube that I want to pass to you. And it says, must African countries continue to lean on the Arab bloc when Africa stands to gain much from Israeli technological advancements?
Well, man does not live by bread alone. There are issues, ideological issues, and that was what I was dragging out before the question interrupted me, that when you go to international organizations and issues arise that African countries are looking for support from those organizations, whether it's UNESCO, World Health Organization, World Trade Organizations, as long as those issues do not involve the national interest of Israel, you get more votes contributed by Arab countries to African positions than, say, from Israel. It's only if the issue involves Israeli national interest that African states, by voting along with Arab states, may antagonize a much larger group that are supporters of Israel. But as long as that situation is not there, people will claim that keeping the countries within African Union and automatically getting their votes in international organizations will be more beneficial to African interests, especially since Israel is not asking for Arab countries to leave the African Union. So it's not an either or situation. Israel simply wants to be, what do you call it? An observer member. And you yourself consider the consequences of the Abrahamic Treaty. There are lots of Arab countries that have very close relationship with Israel. So it is not an either or situation.
Thank you for that, sir. Before we leave Africa, there's another question I want to put to you, sir. This is the story from Equatorial Guinea, where the vice president of that country has lost his appeal against embezzlement that was brought against him. How do you react to that news, sir?
Good and bad. Good in the sense that not just embezzlement, but financial illicit financial transfer of funds and what have you. And the Israeli, the French appeal court found him guilty, confirmed the sentences of the lower court, which, by the way, includes suspended custodial sentence and the seizure of all the assets in France that have come about from money stolen in Equatorial Guinea. It's vice president, you've said. What you didn't add is that he's the son of the ruling president. So it's like it's a family affair. Why? And so it is welcome. The ruling is welcome. Hopefully, other European countries will, follow, not just European countries, the United States and wherever these assets of African ruling elite, where assets are, put away, will follow the French judicial decision. Why I said it's bad news is that a few weeks ago, the French Parliament, I believe, passed a law that where, due to a judicial decision, assets due to illicit financial transfer by foreigners, by foreign presidents and so on, and husbanded in French banks and what have you, where the judicial decision seizes those assets. Those assets must now be returned to the people of the country where they are stolen. The intention, and this is where, this is a perfect illustration of the saying that, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The intention was to prevent the French, was to prevent France as a country seizing those assets and keeping them in France for its own use. And that's why the legislation was that these assets must be returned to the people from whom they are stolen. Now, in this particular case, if you return the assets that this gentleman stole, his father is still the president of the country. He himself is still the vice president of Equatorial Guinea. So, are you not returning the money to him? Is his father not going to hand over those resources to him? Excuse me.
Bless you, sir.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
Do you need a glass of water, sir?
Well, please, water.
While you catch your breath there, let me put a question to you. You've rightly pointed out the fact that sending the money back ultimately goes back to his father, ultimately goes back to him, and effectively they're returning the money to them. In practice, though, how exactly do we return money to the people without returning money to the government of the particular nation? Because it seems to me that to say you're returning the money to the people, to a large extent, is a rather ambiguous statement. Who is the people that money will be returned to? And is that a ploy by the court to keep the situation in a way where, well, this conversation can still go on for a while without necessarily needing the government or the court to get too involved in that particular point? I'd like to know what you think about that, sir.
Thank you. Sorry for now. Is that the decision or the phraseology returning the money to the people is not phraseology by the judiciary. It's phraseology by the legislature. Now, there's a way around that, although it could be a bit difficult, but there's a way around that, which is since it is the government, which in this case the French government, which is going to interpret what constitutes the people, as you said, instead of the money going to government, it could decide that the money will go to NGOs, civil society organizations, assuming that NGOs and civil society organizations have unfettered right to operate in those countries, and that they can be monitored to make sure that the money is used for what it's supposed to be used for, like education. Okay, we are going to use this money to build health centers. You could actually monitor that these health centers are being built. If the government, the sitting government, will allow you to operate. Let me remind you that after the explosion in the Beirut port of that ship, Macron, the French are always involved. They always turn up in all these situations. Macron turned up in Lebanon and pledged that France was going to give money to rebuild Beirut, but that the money is not going to go into the hands of the government, who in the first place are responsible for not monitoring adequately what was going on in the port. Well, since they were not going to get their hands on the money, do you know that the politicians in Beirut, in Lebanon, till today, there's been no new government since that explosion, until last week, when the person was supposed to form a government said he couldn't form a government because there was no agreement between him and the president. And you will recall that last week, I believe, we discussed this because the European Union then imposed sanctions, economic sanctions, on key politicians in Lebanon. So it's possible that France, in interpreting this, not only towards Equatorial Guinea, but towards any country, any medium or low-income countries whose politicians are caught with their fingers, in the pie, will come under the same sanctions that have just been imposed by the new legislation.
Thank you for that, Prof. Before we move to one or two questions from the United States, the Tokyo Olympics is in full swing, and we've seen quite a lot of star athletes, I should say, who have ended up having to withdraw from the competitions because of different issues. What is your take on what is going on with the Tokyo Olympics? And this is not even talking about the COVID-19 situation that may be developing as well. What are your views, sir?
Well, I think I'm sorry, I will have to talk about the COVID-19 implication. I think I must applaud the government of Japan. I must applaud the IOC. I must applaud all the authorities involved in insisting that the Olympics must go on, that the games must go on. Yes, there are problems with COVID-19. There are problems with the Delta variant of it. But you see, Olympics represent I would say the purity of the human spirit on an individual basis. There are athletes, individuals who have spent all their life practicing, going through. I mean, that's all they stand for. Looking for achievement in this particular area. They're not asking for anything else but to simply participate. I think it will have been a crushing defeat of the human spirit. I'm not just talking of the individuals, the human spirit which they embody if the Olympics had been cancelled. COVID-19 represents a challenge to the human race. This will not be the first time we will have that kind of challenge, and it's not going to be the last time. And to some extent, we are saying to ourselves, we will not be defeated. The Olympic athletes collectively represent the spirit of the human race. So I applaud the determination to get on with it. I haven't seen, incidentally, I haven't seen any correlation between the games and the upsurge in COVID-19 infections in Japan. When you see the upsurge in other countries, then that doesn't seem to have been a correlation. So to that extent, I applaud them. The other issue is this, what I will call the mental syndrome as an issue now in sports. And I must confess that I have a conflict within me dealing with that issue. Mental problems are not issues that should be swept under the rug. We must help the athletes and the individuals, because it's not just athletes alone. There'll be students, there'll be painters, there will be people in all aspects of life who will be dealing with mental issues. That society must design programs to help them address this issue. Where I have a problem is if an athlete, or anyone for that matter, knows that they have a mental issue to address, should they be involved in a competitive situation where perhaps at the preliminary stage, others who would have qualified for these competitive positions would have got to that level if those who feel they have these mental issues have withdrawn at that level. I hope you understand what I'm saying. I think getting to the games or getting to a competition, and it's at that stage when your fellow competitors could then not be brought in, to then withdraw at that stage on the basis of inability to cope with the pressure, either of the games or the public or the press or what have you. I think it's a supplementary level where these things should be addressed. So let me round up. One, we must, in a cooperative way, help those who have these mental issues to address. We must help them. We must appreciate that they have a problem. We must also address the issue of at what stage in the competition do you then withdraw from competing, just so that you don't deny other competitors an even chance to be a part.
All right, sir. Thank you so much for your comments there. We've run out of time today, but I think next week there are some questions that would like to hear your views on. For example, President Biden has talked about a move away from the politicizing of intelligence organizations. And of course, the elections that are coming up in Russia later on in the year. Would like to hear your views on some of these points, and we'll bring those to the table next week, sir. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to our viewers who have stayed with us. And we look forward to being here again next week. Thank you very much, Prof, for your time this evening.
Wakanda.
Good night, sir, and good night to our viewers.